Maybe Mom was right. Maybe Grandpa really did lose his mind.
No, I think he was hiding from them.
I was shivering on the curb in the pouring rain, holding my twin sister's hand, our entire lives stuffed into 2 black garbage bags. Our parents had just thrown us out to protect their dirty money. All we had was a rusted brass key to a dead man's sealed cabin. The night my sister, Sophie, and I turned 18 was supposed to be a milestone, a celebration of stepping into adulthood. Instead, it became the night we were erased from our own family. We lived in a sprawling, cold, ultramodern estate in Bellevue, Washington. Our parents, Richard and Eleanor Gallagher, were the titans of Gallagher Freight and Trace, a multi-million-dollar logistics empire that handled high-end, discreet shipping for the ultra-wealthy. To the world, they were philanthropists, untouchable elites who grazed the covers of business magazines. To Sophie and me, they were ghosts who communicated through nannies, boarding school tuition, and heavily drafted legal trusts. But my grandfather, Nathaniel Gallagher, had been different. Grandpa Nate was a former structural engineer and a rugged outdoorsman who smelled of pine tar and peppermint. He was the only person who ever looked at us like we were human beings, not assets to be managed. When he passed away, a year prior to our 18th birthday, my father didn't shed a single tear. He simply locked Grandpa's old study, ordered his belongings incinerated, and labeled the man a paranoid, senile hoarder. I never believed that. Grandpa Nate was sharp as broken glass, until the day his heart stopped. The catalyst for our banishment started purely by accident. The afternoon of our birthday, I was in my father's home office, a room strictly off limits, looking for a specific flash drive he had borrowed from me for a presentation. While rooting through the deep drawers of his custom mahogany desk, my knuckles caught on a wooden lip, a false bottom. Curiosity overrode my common sense. I lifted the thin panel. Beneath it lay a leather-bound ledger and a stack of printed emails spanning back 5 years. I opened the ledger. It wasn't a standard accounting book. It was a secondary set of books, documenting massive, unregulated offshore transfers to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the tax evasion. It was the origin of the money. There were repeated entries labeled NG, patent liquidation, NG, asset seizure, and forged signatures of my grandfather authorizing the sale of vast tracts of commercial land right before he supposedly went crazy. My father hadn't built his empire. He had stolen it from his own father, liquidating Grandpa Nate's life work and locking him away in a remote cabin under the guise of mental decline, funneling the profits to build his pristine reputation. Worse, there were recent emails discussing cleaning up the loose ends, specifically terminating the trust fund set up for Sophie and me the moment we turned 18. I was standing there, ledger in hand, when the heavy oak door clicked shut. My father stood in the doorway, his bespoke Tom Ford suit immaculate, his eyes dead and hollow. My mother, Eleanor, stepped in behind him, holding a crystal glass of bourbon. "Put it down, Arthur," Richard said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You stole everything from him," I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You forged his name. You took his patents. You practically imprisoned him up in the Cascades." Sophie walked into the office right at that moment, freezing as she absorbed the scene. "Artie, what's going on?" My father didn't shout. He didn't deny it. He just walked over to his desk, picked up his phone, and dialed his head of security, a massive, silent man named Griggs. "Griggs, bring 2 trash bags to the main foyer. Arthur and Sophie are leaving us tonight." "Dad, you can't be serious," Sophie gasped, stepping forward. "It's our birthday. It's pouring rain outside." "You are 18 as of midnight," my mother said, taking a slow sip of her bourbon. "Legally, we owe you nothing. You want to snoop into adult affairs, Arthur? Welcome to the adult world. You are completely cut off. Your phones will be deactivated in 10 minutes. Your bank accounts have already been frozen. I'll go to the police," I threatened, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. Richard laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "With what evidence? This ledger? It will be ashes in my fireplace before you reach the front gate. Who will they believe? A billionaire logistics CEO? Or a disgruntled teenager who just got cut off from his trust fund?" Griggs appeared. Within 15 minutes, we were stripped of our house keys, our laptops, and our phones. They allowed us 1 bag each of basic clothing, nothing else. No coats, no wallets. As Griggs shoved us out the heavy mahogany front doors into the freezing September downpour, my mother stood on the porch. "Don't ever contact us again," she said coldly. The heavy iron gates clanged shut behind us. We were 18. We were orphaned by choice, and we had absolutely nothing. Or so they thought. Hidden inside the lining of my right shoe was a small sealed envelope Grandpa Nate had pressed into my hand 3 days before he died. For when the wolves bare their teeth, he had whispered, his grip surprisingly strong. Go to the roost. Sitting on the wet pavement, I pulled the crumpled envelope from my shoe. Inside was a heavy, rusted brass key and a slip of paper with a single set of GPS coordinates and a short message, Tucker's Notch. Don't trust the road. The first 48 hours were a masterclass in human degradation. We managed to hike 3 miles to a 2 4-hour diner, using the sparse change I had in my jacket pocket to buy a single black coffee, just so we could sit in the booth without being kicked out. Sophie, whose asthma always flared up in cold, damp weather, was wheezing heavily. Her face was pale, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. I held her hand across the sticky formica table, watching the waitresses shoot us pitying, nervous glances. What do we do, Artie? She whispered, her voice trembling. We have no money, no credit. Nobody is going to believe us if we go to the cops. Dad practically owns the local precinct. We go to Grandpa's, I said, sliding the brass key across the table. Sophie stared at it. The cabin in the Cascades? Mom and Dad said the county seized it for back taxes months ago. They said it was condemned. Mom and Dad are liars, I replied firmly. Grandpa gave me this for a reason. He knew this was going to happen. He knew Dad would cut us out. We didn't have a car, so we hitchhiked. It took us 2 days of standing on the shoulder of I-5, shivering in our damp clothes, to catch a ride with a long-haul trucker who dropped us off near Highway 530, right on the edge of the Cascade Range. From there, it was a grueling 20-mile trek toward the coordinates. The town closest to the coordinates was a forgotten logging outpost called Oakhaven. It consisted of a single gas station, a hardware store, and a diner called Moe's Mountain Grub. When we walked into the gas station to ask for directions to Tucker's Notch, the cashier, an older man with a thick gray beard, stopped wiping the counter and stared at us. Tucker's Notch? You kids don't want to go up there, he said, his eyes narrowing. That's old Nate Gallagher's land. Or it was. Place is locked up tighter than a bank vault. Heavily chained. Rumor in town is the old man rigged it with traps before he kicked the bucket. County assessor tried to go up there last spring and came back with his tires slashed by a hidden spike strip. We're his grandchildren, I said, my voice hoarse. The cashier softened slightly, reaching under the counter and pulling out 2 bottles of water and a pack of beef jerky. He slid them toward us. On the house. You look like you've been through a war. But I'm warning you, the main logging road washed out 2 years ago. You'll have to take the goat path up the eastern ridge. It's a steep climb. 3 miles, straight up. We thanked him and set off. The climb was agonizing. The Washington wilderness is beautiful but merciless. The air grew thinner and biting cold as we ascended through the towering Douglas firs and dense, wet underbrush. Sophie's breathing became ragged, a terrifying, high-pitched wheeze that forced us to stop every 10 minutes. My legs burned, and my sneakers were completely soaked through with icy mud. Don't trust the road, the note had said. Now I understood why. If Dad had sent people to check the cabin, they would have taken the main road and turned back at the washout, assuming it was inaccessible. By the time the sun began to dip below the jagged tree line, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black, we broke through a thicket of blackberry brambles and stood at the edge of a clearing. There it was, the roost. It wasn't a dilapidated shack like my parents had claimed. It was a fortress. Built of massive, interlocking cedar logs, the cabin sat nestled against the side of a sheer granite cliff face. The windows were heavily boarded up with thick, steel-reinforced plywood. But the most intimidating feature was the front door. It was solid oak, wrapped tightly in heavy, industrial-grade iron chains that met at a massive, rust-proof Yale padlock. Nailed to the wood above the door was a weathered sign. Property of N. Gallagher. Trespassers will be prosecuted. This means you, Richard. Sophie let out a breath that was half sob, half laugh. He really hated Dad, didn't he? Dad earned it, I said, stepping up to the porch. My hands were shaking from the cold and the exhaustion as I pulled the brass key from my pocket. It looked too old, too simple to open such a heavy, modern padlock. I slid the key into the cylinder. It resisted for a moment, the internal pins stiff with disuse. I prayed, pushing harder, wiggling it slightly. Click. The heavy shackle sprang open with a loud, metallic echo that startled a flock of crows from the nearby pines. I unwound the heavy chains, letting them crash to the wooden porch. I grabbed the frozen brass handle of the door, pushed with my shoulder, and shoved it open. A rush of stale, freezing air washed over us, carrying the distinct scent of dried pine, old paper, and machine oil. We stepped inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind us, plunging ourselves into pitch darkness. I fumbled in the dark, my hands running along the rough wooden wall until I found a switch. I flipped it, expecting nothing. To my absolute shock, a low hum vibrated through the floorboards, and a series of heavy, industrial, battery-powered LED lights flickered to life across the ceiling. Grandpa Nate had installed an off-grid solar and battery array. The cabin was not the chaotic nest of a hoarder. It was immaculate. It looked like a cross between a survival bunker and a high-end corporate archive. Along the left wall were rows of canned goods, dried provisions, medical supplies, and winter clothing packed in airtight bins. On the right wall, there was a heavy wood-burning stove with a stack of chopped, dried kindling ready to go. "Artie," Sophie breathed, walking toward a massive wooden table in the center of the room. I immediately set to work. Within 10 minutes, I had a roaring fire going in the cast iron stove. The radiant heat began to thaw our frozen limbs, and Sophie's wheezing gradually subsided as she wrapped herself in a thick wool blanket she found in a cedar chest. Once we were warm, I turned my attention to the center table. It was empty, except for a single, leather-bound journal and a beautifully carved wooden chess piece, a white knight. I opened the journal. The first page was dated 3 years ago, written in Grandpa's precise, architectural handwriting. "To Arthur and Sophie, if you are reading this, the worst has come to pass. Richard has shown his true face, and he has cast you out. I always knew his greed would eclipse his humanity. He thinks he won. He thinks he locked me away to rot while he stripped my life's work to build his fraudulent empire. But I am an engineer. I never build a structure without an escape hatch. I knew I didn't have the strength to fight his lawyers and his bribes in my final days. So, I took the most valuable assets out from under him, right beneath his arrogant nose. He has spent years looking for the foundation of his wealth. I brought it here." The knight moves in an L shape. 2 steps forward, 1 step left. I frowned, looking up from the journal. 2 steps forward, 1 step left. I looked at the table. It was perfectly aligned with the floorboards. I grabbed the white knight chess piece. I stood at the edge of the table, took 2 steps forward, and 1 step to the left. I was standing on a specific, wide plank of oak. I knelt down and pressed against it. It didn't move. "Look at the knots in the wood," Sophie said, kneeling beside me, her eyes sharp. Grandpa always loved mechanical puzzles. There were 3 dark knots in the oak plank. I pressed all 3 simultaneously. A distinct mechanical clack echoed beneath the floor, and the plank popped upward by half an inch. I grabbed the edge and hauled it back. Beneath the floorboards wasn't dirt, it was concrete, and set into the concrete was a massive, vintage Mosler floor safe. It had a classic rotary dial. "There's no combination in the book," I said, flipping frantically through the journal. Sophie gently took the book from me. "Wait, look at the back cover." Tucked into a small sleeve in the back of the journal was a Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of Sophie and me when we were about 7 years old, sitting on Grandpa Nate's lap by a lake. On the back, written in black ink, were 3 numbers, 14 to 0908. "Our birthday," Sophie whispered, "the 14th of September, 2008. I spun the heavy brass dial, right to 14, left past 14 to 09, right to 08. I grabbed the heavy metal lever and pulled. The thick steel door glided open with the smooth, oiled silence of precision engineering. We peered down into the cavity of the safe. Inside were 3 things. First, a stack of heavily bound legal folders. I pulled the top one out and opened it. It contained original, notarized patents for the proprietary routing algorithms that Gallagher Freight and Trace used to dominate the logistics market. But these were the real documents, proving the patents were entirely owned by Nathaniel Gallagher, and specifically willed to Arthur and Sophie Gallagher upon their 18th birthdays. There were also undeniable bank records, signed confessions from a whistleblowing accountant, and irrefutable proof that Richard had committed massive corporate fraud, forgery, and embezzlement to build his company. It was a loaded gun, pointed directly at our father's empire. Second, there was a heavy velvet pouch. I lifted it, it weighed at least 10 pounds. I untied the drawstring and tipped it over the wooden floor. A cascade of brilliant, glittering gold spilled out, clinking musically against the oak. They were solid gold South African Krugerrands. Hundreds of them. "Artie," Sophie gasped, picking one up. The firelight danced off the gold. These are worth thousands of dollars each. There has to be $1 million here." He liquidated his personal emergency accounts before Dad could freeze them, I realized, awe washing over me. He converted it to untraceable gold and hid it. We had walked into this cabin as freezing, starving orphans with nothing but lint in our pockets. In less than an hour, we possessed enough wealth to start our lives over, and enough explosive evidence to utterly destroy the people who had thrown us away. But it was the third item in the safe that made my chest tighten. It was a handwritten letter sealed with wax, simply addressed, "To my grandchildren, time to fight back." I broke the heavy red wax seal on the envelope. The paper inside was thick, yellowed parchment, covered in Grandpa Nate's unmistakable sharp handwriting. Sophie leaned over my shoulder, the ambient glow of the battery-powered LED lights casting long shadows across the cabin's timber walls. We read the words together, the silence of the mountain outside broken only by the crackle of the wood-burning stove. "My dearest Arthur and Sophie, if this letter is in your hands, the worst has happened. Richard has purged you from his life. Do not let this break you. Let it forge you. Your father is a man hollowed out by his own ambition. He did not build Gallagher Freight and Trace. I did. The routing algorithms, the proprietary software that allows the company to bypass standard logistics bottlenecks, those are my patents, and I never signed them over. When I realized Richard was siphoning funds and preparing to declare me mentally unfit to seize control, I moved the core assets. The patents in this safe are the master keys. Without them, Richard is operating a multi-billion-dollar empire on a foundation of stolen intellectual property. But he is dangerous, and he has insulated himself with expensive lawyers and dirty money. You cannot fight him alone, and you cannot go to the local authorities. He owns them. You need a hammer. In the back of this safe, taped to the roof of the steel cavity, is a business card for Harrison Cole. He was the lead federal prosecutor for the Western District of Washington before entering private practice. More importantly, he is my oldest friend, and he knows everything. Use the Krugerrands to survive. Use the documents to destroy the lie. Take back what is yours, but do not let the money poison you as it did your father. Build something better. I love you both. Give them hell. Grandpa Nate. Sophie wiped a stray tear from her cheek, her jaw setting into a hard line. The terrified, wheezing girl who had been shoved out into the rain 48 hours ago was gone. In her place was a survivor. He planned for this. He knew Dad would betray us, and he gave us the exact weapon to strike back, I said, reaching into the very top of the Mosler safe's cavity. My fingers brushed against a small, taped rectangle. I pulled it free. Harrison Cole, Esq. Cole and Partners, Pioneer Square, Seattle. We spent the night in the cabin, eating canned soup heated over the stove and sleeping in actual beds for the first time in days. The next morning, we packed our 2 black garbage bags, but this time, they weren't filled with the pathetic remnants of our childhood. We wrapped the heavy gold Krugerrands in wool socks to muffle their clinking and sealed the legal documents inside double-layered plastic freezer bags to protect them from the elements. The hike down the mountain was treacherous, but the weather had cleared, leaving the Cascade forests crisp and freezing. When we finally reached the small town of Oakhaven, we didn't hitchhike. I walked into the local post office, found a secluded corner, and used a prepaid burner phone bought with one of Grandpa's smaller emergency cash stashes we found in the cabin to call a private car service from Everett. 2 hours later, a sleek black town car pulled up to the dirt shoulder of Highway 530. The driver looked skeptically at our mud-caked clothes and the black garbage bags, but a $300 cash tip secured his silence and a swift, non-stop ride straight into the heart of Seattle. Harrison Cole's office in Pioneer Square was not a flashy, glass and steel corporate monument. It was situated in a historic, red brick building with heavy oak doors and frosted glass. When we walked into the reception area, the secretary immediately stood up, ready to ask us to leave, but I bypassed her, walking straight to the heavy mahogany door that read Harrison Cole, senior partner. "You can't go in there!" she shouted, rushing from behind her desk. I pushed the door open. Sitting behind a desk piled high with legal briefs was a man in his late 60s, with a shock of thick white hair and eyes like flint. He looked up, his expression instantly shifting from annoyance to absolute shock. "Mr. Cole," I said, my voice remarkably steady, "I'm Arthur Gallagher. This is my sister, Sophie. Nathaniel Gallagher sent us." Harrison stood up slowly, waving the panicked secretary away. "Close the door, Martha. Hold all my calls." For the next 3 hours, Harrison Cole meticulously examined the contents of the safe. He inspected the original patents, the forged transfer documents, and the whistleblowing accountant's sworn affidavits. With every page he turned, his face grew darker. "I knew Richard was a snake," Harrison murmured, taking off his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. But the sheer audacity of this. He completely bypassed the federal patent office using a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands to license technology he didn't own. It's not just corporate fraud, it's a massive federal crime, wire fraud, and grand larceny. "Can we use it?" Sophie asked, sitting on the edge of the leather sofa. "Can we stop him?" Harrison leaned back, steepling his fingers. Not only can we stop him, but your timing is almost frighteningly perfect. Are you aware of what your parents are doing this Friday? Sophie and I exchanged confused glances. No, we were cut off from everything. Richard and Eleanor are finalizing a massive corporate acquisition, Harrison explained, pulling up a financial news site on his computer monitor. They are selling Gallagher Freight and Trace to Meridian Global, an international conglomerate, for $2.4 billion. The final contracts are being signed at a private gala at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel this Friday night. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. That's why they threw us out, I realized. The blood roaring in my ears. The trust funds. If we were legally part of the estate when the company sold, we would be entitled to a mandatory review of the company's foundational assets. We would have seen the patents. They had to erase us before the ink dried. Exactly, Harrison said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory legal ferocity. If Richard signs those acquisition papers, he is guaranteeing, under penalty of perjury and federal SEC regulations, that he holds the clear and unencumbered title to the proprietary routing software, which he does not. So, we stopped the sale, Sophie said. No, Harrison corrected, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. We let him sign them. We let him commit federal fraud in front of a room full of witnesses, investors, and Meridian Global's entire executive board. We let him lock the trap from the inside, and then we dropped the hammer. Over the next 3 days, Harrison moved with the terrifying efficiency of a former federal prosecutor. He quietly contacted his former colleagues at the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. Because I was legally 18 and in possession of the true patents, I officially retained him as our counsel, paying his exorbitant retainer in solid gold Krugerrands, which he found endlessly amusing. Using the rest of the gold, Sophie and I bought new clothes. Not the flashy, trend-chasing outfits our parents used to force us to wear for photo ops, but sharp, tailored, undeniable armor. I wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit. Sophie wore a sleek, midnight blue blazer and trousers. We looked exactly like what we were, the rightful heirs to an empire, returning from the dead. Friday night arrived with a torrential downpour, mirroring the night we were thrown out onto the street. But this time, we weren't shivering on a curb. We were sitting in the back of a luxury SUV, parked just down the street from the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle. The hotel's grand entrance was bathed in golden light. Valets were rushing to park a steady stream of Porsches, Bentleys, and Mercedes-Benzes. Inside the Spanish ballroom, the elite of the logistics and financial worlds were gathering to celebrate the crowning achievement of Richard and Eleanor Gallagher. Sitting next to me, Harrison Cole checked his gold pocket watch. The FBI task force is in place in the service corridors. The SEC agents are waiting in the lobby. We wait for the signal. 10 minutes later, Harrison's phone buzzed. A single text message from an undercover agent inside the ballroom. Contracts on the table. Pens out. Showtime, Harrison said. We stepped out of the SUV and walked up the red-carpeted stairs of the Fairmont. The security at the door tried to stop us, but Harrison simply flashed a federal court injunction and pushed past them, Sophie and I flanking him like shadows. We approached the heavy gilded doors of the Spanish ballroom. Through the cracked doors, I could hear the booming, arrogant voice of my father echoing over the microphone. And so, this merger with Meridian Global represents not just the pinnacle of Gallagher Freight and Trace, but a testament to hard work, innovation, and uncompromising integrity. I pushed the doors open. They hit the wall with a thunderous crack that silenced the entire room. 400 heads turned toward the back of the ballroom. Waiters froze with trays of champagne. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing. Standing on the elevated stage at the front of the room were my father, my mother, and the CEO of Meridian Global, standing over a table with 3 leather-bound contracts. My father's face went perfectly slack. The color drained from his cheeks so fast, he looked like a wax figure. My mother dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Arthur? Sophie? Richard stammered, stepping away from the microphone, his polished facade instantly crumbling. Griggs, the massive head of security who had shoved us into the rain, immediately started moving toward us from the side of the room, reaching into his jacket. I wouldn't do that, Mr. Griggs. Harrison Cole's voice boomed across the silent room. He held up a thick, leather-bound folder. Unless you want to add obstruction of justice to your impending conspiracy charges. Who the hell are you? The CEO of Meridian Global demanded, looking frantically between us and my parents. Richard, what is the meaning of this? Who are these kids? Those kids, Harrison announced, striding down the center aisle. Sophie and I walking perfectly in step with him, are Arthur and Sophie Gallagher. The sole legal owners of the proprietary routing patents that your company is currently trying to purchase for $2.4 billion. Murmurs of shock and outrage rippled through the crowd of investors. That is a lie, Eleanor shrieked, her composed, icy demeanor shattering into absolute panic. Security, remove them! They are estranged, disgruntled teenagers. I have in my hand, Harrison continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority, the original, notarized patents filed by Nathaniel Gallagher, alongside a signed affidavit from your former chief financial officer detailing exactly how Richard Gallagher forged his father's signature to transfer those assets into an offshore shell company, assets that were legally willed to Arthur and Sophie upon their 18th birthday. We reached the front of the stage. I looked up at my father. He looked incredibly small. You signed the contracts, Richard? Harrison asked, looking at the table. My father looked down at the pen in his hand shaking violently. He had just signed his name. Perfect, Harrison smiled. You just committed federal wire fraud and attempted to sell stolen intellectual property to a publicly traded company, a felony carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years. Arthur, my father pleaded, his voice cracking, stepping toward the edge of the stage. He dropped the arrogant billionaire persona. He sounded like a terrified, desperate man. Arthur, please, you don't understand. I did this for the family. We can work this out. I can give you the trust funds back, with interest. We're family. Family? Sophie spoke up, her voice cutting through the room like a silver blade. You threw us out into the freezing rain on our birthday with nothing but garbage bags. You told us we were cut off. You told us we were erased. She looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. You were right. We are cut off from you. Harrison raised his hand and gave a sharp nod toward the back of the room. The doors burst open again. This time, it wasn't us. It was a dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with FBI and SEC emblazoned on the back in stark yellow letters. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Investors started shouting, scrambling for the exits. The CEO of Meridian Global slammed his hands on the table, cursing violently at my father, before storming off the stage to consult his own legal team. Richard Gallagher and Eleanor Gallagher, a senior FBI agent, announced, marching up onto the stage with handcuffs drawn. You are under arrest for corporate espionage, wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Don't touch me! Eleanor screamed as an agent grabbed her wrist. She turned her venomous gaze on my father. This was your idea! You said the old man was crazy! You said the kids would never find out! I want a lawyer! I'm cooperating against him! Within 60 seconds, the people who had terrorized our grandfather and discarded us like trash were turning on each other like rabid dogs. We stood in the center of the ballroom and watched as Richard and Eleanor Gallagher were placed in handcuffs, stripped of their dignity, their wealth, and their freedom, and marched out of the very gala meant to crown them as untouchable elites. As they were led past us, my father looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate plea for mercy. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I just watched him go. The fallout was biblical. Meridian Global immediately backed out of the acquisition and filed a massive lawsuit against my parents. The federal government seized all of Richard and Eleanor's personal assets, freezing their offshore accounts and liquidating the Bellevue estate to pay off the massive SEC fines. Because they had forged the foundational documents of the company, their equity was entirely nullified. They were both denied bail due to flight risks. 6 months later, facing a mountain of undeniable evidence, they both took plea deals. Richard received 15 years in federal prison. Eleanor received 8. But the story didn't end with their destruction. Because the patents were legally ours, and because Gallagher Freight and Trace could not operate without them, the board of directors had to come to us. Harrison Cole, acting as our proxy, negotiated a total restructuring of the company. Sophie and I didn't want to run a logistics empire. We were barely 19 by the time the dust settled. But we retained a 51% controlling stake in the company and licensing rights to Grandpa Nate's algorithms. We used the initial licensing payouts to fulfill the true legacy of Nathaniel Gallagher. We didn't buy sports cars or mansions. We bought the mountain. We purchased the entire 500-acre tract of land surrounding Tucker's Notch in the Cascade Range, turning it into a protected private nature reserve. We reinforced the old cedar cabin, expanding it, but keeping the core exactly as Grandpa Nate had built it. The Mosler safe remained in the floor, now serving as a time capsule rather than a vault for stolen futures. Sometimes, when the city feels too loud, Sophie and I take the long drive up the mountain. We sit on the heavy wooden porch of the roost, looking out over the jagged pine trees and the mist rolling off the granite cliffs. We drink black coffee, play chess with the carved wooden pieces, and listen to the silence. We lost our parents at 18, but we found something infinitely more valuable in that sealed cabin. We found our grandfather's strength, our own resilience. and the undeniable proof that no matter how high the Tower of Lies is built, the truth and karma will always bring it crashing down. And that is the story of how Grandpa Nate's final, hidden gift helped us tear down our toxic parents' empire and take back our rightful lives. If you enjoyed this journey of brutal betrayal and ultimate karma, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves a sweet revenge story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out. What would you have done with the gold? Comment below.